Welcome back to Indie Cult Horror for the last time. Today is the finale. This is the last episode of this series. I wanted to take a moment to just kind of look back on the project, what it originally was, what it became recently to me, and just kind of an overall feel, kind of a bringing it to conclusion. Indie Cult Horror, as you guys have seen it, has been a 19 episode series with a little preamble of interviews that I shot in the early 2000s while working on my master's degree at the New School in Manhattan. I was a media studies major, and this all took place because of, really, I took a pre-production course, a pitching planning course, and I came up with the idea, what if we started making extras without reissuing the DVDs? What if we could just round up new footage, new interviews, new behind the scenes, all of these types of elements without having to rebuy the same movies over and over again? That was my initial concept for Indie Cult Horror. So this is the age of Anchor Bay putting out God knows how many editions of The Evil Dead and Dawn of the Dead and all of my favorite movies, but of course I would have to buy them over and over because I wanted to see, well, what new thing did they have this time? Because it was always like the director's cut, the extra special edition, the anniversary edition. You know, there was always a reason to put bigger and more. So what if we eliminated the film from that? Because the licensing, the expensive part, right, is to make to have the movie be available. So cutting out the middleman of actually having to have the rights to own a film, what if I could just put out a series? And the original concept also was that it would be a DVD line of sorts, of maybe half hour to an hour per DVD. And I would culminate interviews and get other behind the scenes information and make these kind of little docs that were featurettes without the feature. So that was the concept. That's what Indie Cult Horror was when I pitched it to my class. And I, as part of my research for the project, I actually tried to contact quite a few celebrities in the horror genre. I reached out to a couple of actors, some filmmakers, people who were going to be in the New Jersey area, just to see, is this a feasible thing? And that was my first semester at the New School. So by the time I got to my last semester, when I was finishing up my program, it became, wait, I can actually do this. I can make this project somewhat a reality. So I ended up making it my thesis. I started to get responses from people. Some, unfortunately, I did not get to interview. Like, I do distinctly, and I have them saved. I remember emailing with Bruce Campbell, because he was due to come visit the New York area. And unfortunately, I believe that's the year he was in an accident. He wasn't able to make his appearances, so I wasn't able to interview him. Starting to hear back from people and starting to say, well, what if I just go and introduce myself? So I took that approach. As opposed to contacting people beforehand, I would just show up, dressed a little nicer than I would usually for a con, and tell them I was a grad student working on a project, and would they be interested in letting me get 15 minutes to a half hour of their time. Some people were far more generous than I expected. People like H.G. Lewis and Gunnar Hansen gave me an hour. Some gave me 10 or 15 minutes, and I was happy for it. In the course of doing the project, it took me like 2 years, I guess, to kind of round up all the interviews. I went to a couple of Chiller Theater conventions, a couple of Monster Manias when they first started, Horrifying when they were down in Maryland area still. And very early on, I started at the Fangoria Weekend of Horrors in New York City. So it was a mishmash of kind of doing the legwork of it, as in, emailing. I remember with Gunnar Hansen, I don't think he had an email. I was given an address to send to, and I sent him a letter. Which seems so archaic right now, right? And then getting the courage to just do it in person and introduce myself. I did go through the process of, like any project like this, I did have a waiver people had to sign giving me the rights to the footage, which leads me to the fact that I did not do 19 interviews. I did 20 interviews for this documentary series, and the 20th interview is the person I left out, and I know it was at a Chiller Theater, I can't remember when, and that was Tom Savini. Tom Savini would only sign my waiver if I put a clause that said only for use in the classroom. He did not want me to share the interview in any other way. If something happened where I was able to release this project as a film, he didn't want to be part of it. He just agreed, you can interview me for your class. So, you know, I took what I could get. I didn't even rewatch that interview, to be honest, when I did this process of digitizing them and putting them up for you guys on YouTube. It wasn't an awesome experience, and it kind of, you know, I would love an opportunity to get a do-over with Tom Savini and do a full interview. I'll say that interview for me was not great. As someone who watches a lot of documentaries, reads a lot of interviews in magazines, things like that, there are certain stories for every filmmaker and every movie that become kind of synonymous with them, right? With Gunnar Hansen, it was him telling the story about the hottest day on the set of Texas Chainsaw when they did the dinner sequence and like the rotting head cheese. Getting him on camera to tell a story, I'd seen him say in so many documentaries before, there was something about that was just like, yes, this is mine now too. Like something where it becomes like it's an iconic thing, and I wanted it to be part of my project as well. I felt like the Savini interview, I was trying too hard to get those moments, and he wasn't really into it. He didn't want to tell the stories he'd told a million times. And I mean, I can understand that. I remember it was an awkward interview too, because most times I would do the interviews kind of away from other people, and there were a lot of people around when I was trying to do this interview, which was a little strange. Like I said, one day when I'm making another documentary, another series, another project, I would love the opportunity to get a second try on that. So that's the only interview that I was not able to share with you guys. So everything else you saw is all of the raw footage that I was able to get while working on this project. It was not feasible to say I'm going to make this series of DVDs and that'll be my thesis project. In the end, as a thesis project, it was to kind of take what I had been working on and retool it into a more traditional documentary series. So what it became was 2 one-hour episodes. So 2 one-hour documentaries. I think one was a little under an hour and the other one was a little over an hour. So, you know, about 2 hours. I edited it in a fairly traditional documentary fashion. I tried to group the interviews in categories. Like people who worked with Romero were one section. Working on Texas Chainsaw was a section. Working on the Evil Dead film was a section. So these were in groupings. Villains was a section. So going through topic-wise to kind of pull all of this information that I had culminated and find common threads between the different interviews. And I went through old magazines, stills, promotional stills, poster art. And then after scanning all of those kind of still images, I did 2 things that were going to get me in trouble with this film ever getting outside of the project it was. And that was, I used film clips that I knew I did not have the rights to use under the pretense this is a educational project, with the hopes that I would then try to sell this as a package to some place that owned the rights to those movies. You know, this was like my way in to like say to Anchor Bay, like, look, you own all the movies that we're talking about in this chapter. Would you take on this as something to distribute? And in reality, it would have needed a lot of work for it to go that way anyway. As you guys can tell, because you've watched some of these. Some have good audio, some have awful audio. But I mean, there would be ways to if nothing else, I was assuming I was going to have to transcribe them and put, you know, captions at the bottom. But, so it was dual in that way. In one way, it created a finalized looking documentary for my class, for my project that I could hand in to my, my advising professor. And then on the other side, it was like me going to someone and saying, look, you already own the rights to this. I've just brought you a whole bunch of new interviews to go with it. Would you be interested in distributing it? So, what happens is, about a year later, not even, the summer after I finish, I bring a copy with me to Horrifying Convention, where Anchor Bay always was very visible, and I spoke with someone who worked at Anchor Bay, who I'd come to know and interview in other projects I've done, and said, hey, can you take a look at this for me and tell me what you think? And he did. And he basically came back and said, we don't even own the rights to all these movies. You've got so many movies in here, it's impossible. And it would be a huge task for somebody to be able to pay for this. This is like the most expensive movie that anybody would buy. So that alone was pretty much his reasoning after a moment to be like, I don't know if this is going to work for us. So I guess I was a little disappointed by that, but I understood where he was coming from. Because on top of it, we don't think of it as much, but all those stills that I got from like Fangoria magazine and stuff, and headlines and things from Gore Zones and stuff, I didn't own the rights to that stuff either. I would have had to go to Fango and ask for permission. On top of that, I had used as kind of a theme song for the documentary series a song by the Cramps, Gorehound, because I thought it was really fitting, and I really dig the Cramps. So I figured I may have an option of contacting them. There were so many stories, we tell them a lot in communications classes, of the ability to speak directly through correspondence with an artist and say, I'd really love your piece of music and I would love to use it in my movie or my show. Is it possible for me to get the rights from you to use it just for this? There's the myth of the $1 contract because, you know, I like you, kid, here's for $1 you can use my song. So, you know, they're in the back of my head. I'm hoping, you know, maybe the Cramps will be like that. So I never really ended up going that route of trying to figure out if I could use their song, because there was no way I could afford anything else. So the project kind of died. For the next year, I basically had made VHS copies of the film and gone around to conventions again, did another pass-through basically, giving copies to people that I interviewed who were in it and thanking them for their time. And that process between the interviews, like getting the interviews with people and then going back and giving tapes to most of them that I was able to, I feel like I got a nice connection with some of those people. People who still to this day, and I mentioned it in many of these interviews, there were several people who when I would see them again in person, they'd be like, oh, Victoria, how are you? So I felt like if nothing else, I had made an impression on some people that I thought were really cool and awesome people. And, you know, if nothing else, I had that. You know, I plugged my video camera into my DVD burner and made copies of every interview onto DVD. I sent a set of those off for copyright because I owned this stack of interviews, and I put them in a shoebox, and that was it. Nothing else really came of it because I didn't know what else to do with it. I had no way of revisiting it as far as I could tell. So fast forward a couple years later, 12, 13 years later maybe, I decided to go back and get my doctorate. And I basically come with this preconceived idea of I would like the opportunity to have the ability to document some of the people that we are losing from a generation of filmmakers. And many of them are the people that I had already interviewed. So that was my case in point. Where my focus has now shifted from independent horror in general to the perspective of women in horror. And my interest in women in horror particularly is in the way women are portrayed in film, in genre films. So I'm going into my doctorate with that idea. I want to talk about how women are shown in film and how it has changed over time, and how horror films and science fiction films have particularly had a big impact in all this. So that's what I'm going in on, and then while I'm there, I'm discussing, well, this is what I had done as a master's program, and talking about this project. I had the ability to interview all these people, and unfortunately quite a few of them are no longer with us. So I'm starting to take classes at this point that are explaining to me concepts like, public humanities and oral histories and all of these ways that we keep a history of things that aren't the history of the world or the history of our country, but the history of the things that are important to us, and how an oral history of horror can keep it alive. And for future generations who will never have the opportunity to meet an H.G. Lewis and may not quite understand his impact, if you have them sit down and watch Blood Feast and then watch this interview, they're going to go, wait, this guy did a lot. But they may not have known that had it not been recorded. So this is what I'm starting to realize in my doctoral work, is that oral histories are important, and what I had done, even if it didn't become the series that I had envisioned, was essentially an oral history of horror. And so that's what kind of made me start thinking about what I'd done again, and kind of how can I revisit this. And talking to a lot of people at that point who were getting into podcasting, and me realizing I don't need to go out and find someone to distribute for me. I'm not going to make a profit on this, so I don't really need to do anything more than make it available. So that's what I did, and that's what you guys have been able to see through Indie Cult Horror. It is essentially, I have created an archive of people that I think are important to the independent horror film scene and what we consider cult horror. And watching these interviews kind of live on the internet, I'm starting to realize that a few people I've interviewed are not commonly interviewed and are not readily available. There's not a lot of other interviews out there of them. So that's fulfilling to me to know that this is useful for people. People are enjoying to hearing these stories. So that part I appreciate, and I'm thankful that you guys are finding it. I still get clicks and comments on the very first episode, so I love that. And just to go down real quick, so like I said, the first one was H.G. Lewis, which was someone who I went into just thinking, I know he's important. He's the man that brought gore to color. He was doing something totally different than anybody else, but in such almost an Ed Wood kind of way to me. So I wasn't a huge fan. I was a fan of a couple of his movies, but I wasn't like a huge fan of his whole authorship, because I knew the man made all different types of stuff. He made skin flicks, he made whatever it was the thing that he knew people wanted at the time. But it wasn't until I sat down and really talked to him that I appreciated more just how much he really did. He was just like an endless trove of wonderful stories. So I'm very happy that I started out on such a high bar with H.G. Lewis. After that, John Russo. Russo, of course, the co-writer of Night of the Living Dead, who went on to very much, as much as we think of George Romero as like the godfather of horror, and the independent auteur that there is in the genre, Russo's gone even more indie than Romero was, and he's still making movies today, and he does it all. He writes them, he shoots them, he's very involved with the entire process, and he was someone who's kind of the epitome of the things I was talking about. So it was really cool to get some comments from Russo in there. Bill Lustig was third. He was, of course, the man who made Maniac, the man who ended up being, at the time, he was just starting Blue Underground. He was an interesting interview. He was one of those gritty New York City, Times Square sleaze kind of period. He represented that to me. The fourth episode, Gunnar Hansen, which became one of my favorites in the series, who hadn't really been doing interviews for quite a while because he just didn't feel the need to do them anymore. When I contacted him, he was interested in the fact of what I was trying to do. The fact that I was doing it for school, for higher education. And he was very off the bat, he was very personable. He told stories that I didn't expect him to tell my camera. He had no qualms talking about they weren't going to pay me enough. That was an awful situation I didn't want to get into. That, you know, he could literally go down the line. Didn't faze him at all. And he was just a very real person. He put on no airs. I could say every time I saw Gunnar after, he was still totally like that real sweet person. The 5th episode was David Hess. I was so surprised to find out that this episode has more hits than anything I've ever done. Because when I realized after the fact was he had not done a ton of interviews that ended up on YouTube. And he's another person. Last House on the Left is not an easy film for me to watch, and people mistook that, I think. There were some comments that I don't think still exist on my YouTube page, of people saying that why, if you hate the movie, why would you bother interviewing someone about it? And it's like, I didn't hate the movie. The movie was almost too well made, to the point that it was painful to watch sequences that as I got older and the more I watched the film, in various stages of my life, I realized these sequences are so small, but they left such a big impact. And it made me kind of like a little scared of him. I was a little intimidated. But talking to him in person, much like Gunnar, here's one of these scariest individuals on film who are very sweet and wanted to just talk to me about, well, what are you doing? What's your project? And let's, what can I do to help? And I remember when I brought the VHS tape of the finished project to David Hess at a show. He's like, a video? Everybody's doing DVD now. And I go, I can't afford DVD. I can make copies of VHS though. And he's like, you want me to digitize it for you? The fact that David Hess asked me, do you want me to digitize your movie for you? I could do that for you. And I was just, I didn't take him up on the offer. It proved to me I needed to make a better effort to find a way to do it myself. But it was just so nice of him. I will never forget that. And unfortunately, these are the people that aren't at conventions anymore and aren't with us. But I just remember that moment. It's like I remember the moment, seeing Gunnar a year later, and him, coming around to say hi and give me a hug. Like, these are just, those moments are real, and that's what I mean about the connections that meant a lot, if nothing else, of this series. Number 6 was Reggie Bannister. Reggie was such an icon to me of conventions. He was like Bruce Campbell in that fact that he was at all the cons at that time. He was just like fun-loving. He talks about how, he understands that, you guys love these movies because they're fun. I'm not gonna try and think that this is deep. And yeah, you know what, Phantasm is pretty deep. But so he was such a great cool guy to interview. His wife was Gigi, was very sweet. I talked to her quite a bit about being in independent film and what it was like for them as independent filmmakers, and I just remember that interaction was great. And I think I captured Reggie at that particular moment in time. So I'm thankful for that. Kevin Van Hentrick was episode 7. He did not do a ton of conventions, and I can't really say I saw a lot of interviews with him, but Basket Case is another one of those sleazy New York horror films that just personify like that late 70s, early 80s, that I just wanted as part of this kind of overlapping cult horror genre. And he's an artist, so him talking about, yeah, I did these kind of funny, wacky movies, and we just did whatever because we were just creating, and it was cool, and that was an energy I didn't expect, and I'm so glad that I was able to get an interview with him, because that I thought was very cool to hear, like, well, what do you do? And he, I was a sculptor, and to hear him talking about sculpture was really exciting, because it's like, oh, that's cool, you really are still doing it. So that was cool. 8 was Bill Mosley. Bill Mosley, who to me now, I mean, like, this is the early stages of, you know, him being Otis, and how much I have, like, he's been personified the House of a Thousand Corpses, Devil Rejects, Three from Hell, that whole thing, in this amount of intensity of that character coming out of what we all knew him from as Chop Top in Texas Chainsaw. And I was so glad to get the opportunity to talk to him about just the differences in those, you know, those movies, and the other films he had worked on. And I feel like, you know, I was just so excited to talk to him, because I just love those roles that he plays. So it was great that he was just willing to just, yeah, let's talk. Come on, we'll talk. And that was so much the spirit of so many people in this that I really appreciate. That I think is the ability to have more than a 5-second interaction with somebody at a con, that I think led a lot of people to saying, yeah, sure, I'll do an interview. Why not? I'm here. You're here. Let's do it, you know? And I love that. Number 9 was Russ Streiner. That was probably like the first interaction I think I had with Russ Streiner. Now, thanks to like Living Dead Weekend and all of the Garth events and things, I think I know him a little bit better. So the interview is very short. It was such a bad room for sound, so I apologize for that. But I've gotten to interview Russ again since then, and the impact that he's had in Pittsburgh film, you know, that's a lot, and that is independent cinema. It's the ability to create a film scene and to be very actively part of it, and bringing film to where you are is very important. And you know, he's someone who really does that in spades. 10 was Bill Heinzmann, another person unfortunately not with us anymore. He was, and I think I told the story then, he was the first person I ever met at a convention that I got an autograph from. And that had a huge impact on me. This is the very first zombie in modern horror. And, you know, once you sit down and really talk to him, he's more than just number one zombie, right? He's the guy who was also doing cinematography, and he was doing still photography, and he was around on so many more sets than just Night of the Living Dead. And, you know, working on Russo's project, working on his own film. I mean, I'm glad I had the opportunity to document some of that. Right after him, episode 11 was Judith O'Day. This was the first interview I did with Judith. I've interviewed her again since as well. Talking to her about her experience on making Night of the Living Dead. This interview was far more of a nuts and bolts kind of interview about the film, and what it was like to be part of it, and what it's like to see people still caring about it at that time. What was it, like 40 years later? Now that we're 50 plus years later from that film, and having gotten to talk to her again about what the role of Barbara meant to her is, I mean, I love the idea of, I got to continue that interview that I did first with this project, and then add to it much later as I started my current project. So I really appreciate that. Number 12 is Kyra Schoen. Kyra Schoen is so cool. I love Kyra. I've gotten to hang out with her at conventions since and talk to her more, and she realizes that she was part of something that was huge, and she was a very small part of it. And her perspective on everything is always so interesting to me, because she comes at it from a different angle. She was a little kid on that movie that we're all still talking about 53 years later. So definitely a different point of view, and I totally appreciate that she was willing to talk about that with me. 13 was Doug Bradley. I'm gonna be honest, Doug Bradley totally did not fit the confines of my project when I first laid it out. Like, I mean, I was talking to all these American filmmakers. Here's somebody who worked on movies in England. I was talking about films made completely independently that were cult status. He worked on a film that may have been small budget, but blew up, and you know, is still one of the most famous horror movies ever by being part of the Hellraiser series. So he didn't traditionally fit what I set my mind to do, but it was one of those, I got a camera, can I fit this in? Can I make this work? And I did think about, like, well, okay, it was made in England, but it still was fairly indie in that respect, that New World is not, you know, they're not Universal, they're not MGM or whatever. You know, this was still a small production comparatively to others, but really only the first film fit that. And after that, everything started to get exponentially bigger. So I tried to kind of find a way to stick to those early days. And, you know, he was totally game. He was very cool. He was very chilled out. And I'm so glad to add like a huge name like that, like Doug Bradley, to my documentary series. So that was awesome. Number 14 is Tom Sullivan. Tom Sullivan, who is someone who I kind of knew who he was. I knew he worked on Evil Dead, but his name did not come up a lot when you read about Evil Dead, and I did not realize all the things he did. Like, I didn't know the original poster art was him. He made the book. He did the special effects and the makeup on site. Did not know all that until I really sat down and looked into it and then talked to him, and I was so... that interview was so cool for me to be like, wow, so you were involved so much. Like, you did so much on one of the most important films to me, period. And I felt like this was somebody whose story just wasn't as well known, and I wanted to help tell it. That's like one of those other pinnacle moments for me, was to interview Tom Sullivan. And then after Tom Sullivan, at the same con, the next day, I interviewed the Ladies of Evil Dead. The Ladies of Evil Dead are awesome. I mean, for a moment there when they were touring together like that, it was so cool. That it was just like, here's 3 people I never thought I'd ever meet. And they were very accessible. They were very funny. They were very chatty. They would tell you all kinds of crazy stories about what it really was like, as opposed to what Sam Raimi would tell you and what Bruce Campbell would tell you when you see them interviewed on documentaries and things like this, and or interviews that they did in magazines back in the day. Even this was the real world. Between Tom Sullivan and the Ladies of Evil Dead, I feel like I finally learned the true story of the making of that movie, and I was like ecstatic. I was like such a little kid, I felt like, doing those 2 interviews, because here I am like really shedding light on this movie for me, where I felt like after all these years and things that I've read about it and all the magazines, I only knew like half the story, because I only knew Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, Rob Tappert did all the work, and they got, you know, 4 actors to come in and help them out. Yeah, well, there was a lot more to it than that. So cool to have talked to all 4 of them about Evil Dead. 16 was Scott Reiniger. Scott Reiniger, his career is so crazy that he, I mean, like, he talks about in the interview that he did some film, he did some commercials, he did some theater, and then he's helping with, like, speeches and things like that, and helping people. Wow, this is a total different kind of what I expected, you know. But that was a fun interview too, because he had some really... he wasn't the most talkative person, but he still had some real fun moments that he wanted to share. And he you know, did Dawn of the Dead and Night Riders, 2 of my favorite movies. So it was really cool to get to the moment to be able to talk to him about those. So I was super happy with that. The next interview was Laurie Cardell. Laurie Cardell, who I absolutely love, idolize, and she knows this about me. But this, just like Judith O'Dea, this became the first interview I did with Laurie. And I love that could happen. Here's someone that I never thought I'd get to talk to. And not only did I get to talk to her that one time, but because of that, I feel like I know her a little better now than just, you know, a fan watching someone in their favorite movie. And I can go to her and say, you know, can I interview you again, but about a different aspect, or about a different, thinking of it in a different light. And she's pretty game, so that's pretty awesome. 18 was Greg Nicotero. And So this interview, okay, it's only a half hour, and it's at, I mean, what, we're talking 2004, and it's 2021 now, but watching it again when I was editing it, it was like, this is a full recap of his story. He gives, until that time, and that moment when I captured that interview, he gives a retrospective of his career. And it blew me away to sit down and listen to it again and be like, wow, he's really talking about how much George Romero led to who he is today. How much Tom Savini led to the man he is at that moment. Remembering that this is the Greg Nicotero before The Walking Dead. So how much he appreciates all the people. I mean, it helps we were at a convention that was essentially, you know, George Romero was the guest of honor, and everyone around was kind of part of that world. But I think it just put him in that mindset of thinking, wow, if it hadn't been for these people, I would not be here today. And to think that that was so many years before who we think of Greg Nicotero now. Now we think of Greg Nicotero, like, oh, Walking Dead, the current incarnation of Creepshow. He's the man behind so much. But yeah, I was blown away when I watched that, and I was just really proud that I got to record that interview. Getting to look at him at this moment right before everything got huge. So I'm happy with that. And the last interview with Linnea Quigley, it was a good interview. I was thankful for it. She's such an icon of the horror genre that I really wanted to include her. And I appreciated the opportunity of talking to her. And just like everybody else. So of the 20 people, or the 20 interviews that I did, 22, gotta admit, The Ladies Evil Dead is a 3. So, even with Savini and the fact that you guys aren't getting to watch that, you know, of all the interviews, he's probably the person who's most interviewed. So that's another thing where maybe not having him in this collection, it doesn't hurt, because there's so many other ways you can hear Savini tell his stories, which I highly recommend you do, because he's a real important factor in modern horror, in independent horror, in cult horror, in all of those things. So in the end, looking back, I'm glad I took the time to share these with you guys, because I'm happy when I get to see comments or when people tell me, you know, that they appreciate these interviews and getting to see them and seeing people, and it's created a bit of a time capsule. Looking back almost 20 years later, you know, of what horror conventions were, who were at horror conventions at the time, and, you know, where these people were in their lives and their careers. So I'm thankful that you guys are getting something out of that, and I appreciate when viewers reach out and let me know, because, you know, it's cool to know that people are, you know, people are watching, and people, this was my hope and my dream, was that it would find an audience of people like myself who appreciate what all these people have done for the genre. So in closing, I'd like to thank you guys for being part of this journey with me, this kind of reliving this moment, and you know, to plug a little bit, I will say, I going back today and looking at my episode 0 for this, many of the other things that aren't part of these interviews that I said I would do, the Horror Academic became a separate series, and I'm thankful for that, because it leaves this as an encapsulated moment in time, and the Horror Academic is whatever it is now. And then hopefully in the future I'll be able to share the next leg of these interviews and what comes of my research next. So thanks again, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and thanks for hanging out with me and spending some time in my archives.